Ted Bundy's childhood was marked by instability, secrecy, and confusion, which some psychologists believe contributed to his later behavior as one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, Bundy's early life was shaped by complex family dynamics and a lack of identity. Ted Bundy was born as Theodore Robert Cowell to his unmarried mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell. At the time, societal stigma around illegitimacy was strong, and to avoid scandal, his mother's parents raised Ted as their own child. This led to a confusing family dynamic in which Ted was led to believe that his mother was actually his older sister, while his grandparents assumed the roles of his parents. This lie about his parentage persisted throughout his early childhood and into his teenage years. Ted did not learn the truth about his mother until he was a teenager, and the revelation reportedly had a profound impact on his sense of self. Ted's biological father's identity was never publicly confirmed. His birth certificate lists a man named Lloyd Marshall, though there are rumors that his grandfather, Samuel Cowell, may have been his father, raising disturbing possibilities about the family dynamic. Ted Bundy's grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, were strict and domineering figures in his life. Samuel, in particular, was reportedly an abusive and volatile man with a violent temper. He was known for being emotionally and physically abusive to his wife, his children, and the family pets. He also held racist and bigoted beliefs, which he expressed openly at home. Bundy's early exposure to his grandfather's violent behavior and authoritarian control likely influenced his developing psyche. Some psychologists believe this environment could have contributed to his own tendencies toward control and violence later in life. When Bundy was around 4 years old, his mother took him and left her parents' home. They moved to Tacoma, Washington, where she married a man named Johnny Culpepper Bundy in 1951. Ted took his stepfather's last name, becoming Ted Bundy. Johnny Bundy was a working-class man who tried to bond with Ted, taking him on camping trips and outings. However, Ted never formed a close relationship with his stepfather, often resenting him for not being wealthier or more sophisticated. Ted distanced himself from his new family, and despite Johnny Bundy's efforts, rejected his stepfather's authority and affection. As a child, Ted Bundy appeared shy and socially awkward, though he managed to keep up a relatively normal exterior. He did well in school and participated in activities such as Boy Scouts and church events. However, his introverted nature and difficulty forming meaningful relationships hinted at underlying issues. Though Bundy was generally seen as a bright and polite young boy, there were early warning signs of his darker tendencies. Some family members later recalled disturbing behavior, such as Ted surrounding himself with knives as a young child or showing cruelty to animals. Despite these red flags, he was able to maintain a facade of normalcy through much of his youth. As a teenager, Bundy struggled socially and had difficulty forming lasting friendships or romantic relationships. He was described as a loner, and despite his intelligence and academic achievements, he often felt disconnected from his peers. Bundy's teenage years were marked by an ongoing identity crisis. Learning that his sister was actually his mother reportedly shook him deeply, leading to feelings of betrayal and confusion about his family and his place in the world. His feelings of inadequacy, combined with his rejection of his stepfather, further alienated him. During his adolescence, Bundy began to develop an interest in violent crime and the idea of power and control. He would later admit to being fascinated by crime stories and pornography, which may have fueled his emerging violent fantasies. Ted Bundy's childhood was defined by secrecy, confusion, and a lack of emotional connection, all of which likely contributed to his troubled psychological development. His early experiences with family deception, his exposure to violence, and his feelings of isolation set the stage for the dark, manipulative behavior he would later exhibit as an adult. Despite these troubling signs, Bundy managed to project an outward appearance of normalcy throughout his childhood, making the horrific nature of his later crimes all the more shocking to those who knew him. Bundy's first known murders occurred in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in Washington and Oregon. He began in the Seattle area, focusing on college campuses like the University of Washington. He abducted women from public places, often using charm or a ruse, such as pretending to be injured, to lure them into his car. Shortly after starting in Washington, he expanded his killings to include areas in Oregon, taking victims from similar public locations. By the fall of 1974, Bundy moved to Utah to attend law school in Salt Lake City. He continued his murders there, often abducting women from public places like parks or streets. His methods stayed consistent, using deception to lure his victims before attacking and murdering them. Bundy's crimes spread into Colorado by early 1975. He abducted and murdered women from resort towns, often targeting them while they were alone in public spaces. His remains disposal sites were often remote mountainous areas. Bundy's murderous spree also reached Idaho during this period. Idaho, he kidnapped and killed one of his victims in Idaho, leaving few traces of her after the crime. Bundy was arrested in Utah in 1975 for a traffic violation and subsequently linked to several abductions and murders across various states. However, he escaped custody in 1977 while being transferred between Colorado jails. After his second escape, he fled to Florida. After escaping to Florida, Bundy committed his final murders. In January 1978, he attacked a sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee, where he murdered 2 women and seriously injured 2 others. Weeks later, he abducted and killed a 12-year-old girl, marking his final known murder. Bundy's murders spanned 4 years across multiple states, involving similar tactics of luring young women into his car, often under false pretenses, before attacking them. He was finally caught in 1978 in Florida, bringing an end to his killing spree. Ted Bundy's horrific crimes left a profound and lasting impact on the victims' families and the world. His charm, intelligence, and ability to blend into society while secretly committing heinous acts of violence shocked and terrified people across the United States and beyond. The aftermath of Bundy's actions is reflected in the emotional trauma experienced by the victims' families, changes in law enforcement tactics, and the cultural fascination with Bundy that continues today. For the families of Bundy's victims, the aftermath was marked by grief, confusion, and unimaginable trauma. Many of these families spent months, sometimes years, not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, as Bundy was able to elude authorities for a long time. Once the murders were revealed, families had to grapple with the horrific details of their daughters' and sisters' brutal deaths. Some families never received the closure of finding their loved ones' remains. As Bundy didn't always reveal the locations of the bodies, the families were left with deep emotional scars, struggling to come to terms with the senseless loss of their loved ones. The brutality of Bundy's crimes, combined with his public persona as a seemingly normal, educated man, made the murders even more incomprehensible. The long, drawn-out trial process, particularly in Florida, meant that many families had to relive the pain in public. Bundy's infamous self-representation in court added to the anguish, as he used the legal system to prolong proceedings and attract media attention, delaying justice. Some families felt a degree of closure with Bundy's eventual conviction and execution in 1989. However, for others, the pain and trauma endured long after his death. Ted Bundy's crimes exposed significant gaps in the way law enforcement agencies communicated and collaborated across state lines. Bundy committed murders in several states, exploiting the fact that police departments in different jurisdictions were not sharing information effectively. His case led to significant changes in police procedures and criminal investigations. One of the major legacies of the Bundy case was the push for better interagency cooperation. The creation of national databases like the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, in the 1980s was a direct response to the difficulties law enforcement faced in tracking serial killers like Bundy across state lines. Bundy's case helped advance the field of criminal profiling. The FBI began to focus more on understanding the behavior patterns of serial killers, studying cases like Bundy's to develop profiles that could help catch future offenders. Bundy's ability to blend into society and use his charm to lure victims brought attention to the concept of stranger danger. His case led to widespread fear and a rethinking of how people, particularly young women, interact with strangers in public places. Ted Bundy's story captivated the public, and his crimes continue to be a subject of fascination in popular culture. Bundy was one of the first criminals whose trial and story were extensively covered by national media. His charm, courtroom antics, and complex personality made him a figure of morbid fascination. This media coverage has endured, with documentaries, books, films, and podcasts continuing to explore his life and crimes. Bundy's case intensified public fear of serial killers in the 1970s and 1980s. His ability to appear normal, even likable, while committing such violent acts made people question who they could trust. His crimes shattered the image of serial killers as easily identifiable monsters and showed that they could be anyone, even someone who appeared respectable and well-educated. Bundy became a symbol of the charming psychopath and is often referenced in discussions of criminal psychology. His case led to a broader interest in understanding the mind of the serial killer, influencing both academic research and popular culture's portrayal of killers. The legacy of Ted Bundy's crimes is multifaceted. On one hand, it's marked by the pain and trauma inflicted on his victims' families and the fear he instilled in the public. On the other hand, it also brought about significant advancements in law enforcement techniques and criminal psychology. Bundy remains one of the most infamous serial killers in history, and his case is frequently cited in discussions of criminal justice, psychology, and media representation of violent crime. Ted Bundy's time in prison was a mix of manipulation, legal maneuvering, and eventual isolation. Throughout his incarcerations, Bundy used his intelligence and charm to interact with fellow inmates, guards, and even his legal team. However, as his crimes came to light and his execution date drew closer, his time in prison became increasingly grim. Bundy was first arrested in Utah in 1975 on suspicion of aggravated kidnapping and was linked to several murders. During this period, Bundy was housed in jails in Utah and later Colorado, awaiting trial. Despite being incarcerated, Bundy's charisma and legal knowledge allowed him to manipulate those around him. Bundy had a knack for charming prison staff, fellow inmates, and even legal officials. His intelligence and experience studying law gave him a reputation as a model prisoner in some ways, even though he was incredibly dangerous. Bundy famously escaped from custody twice. His first escape occurred in June 1977 when he jumped out of a courthouse window during a pretrial hearing in Colorado. He was recaptured after several days. His second escape, in December 1977, involved Bundy sawing through a light fixture in his cell and losing 30 pounds to squeeze through the hole. After this escape, he fled to Florida, where he committed his final murders. After Bundy was recaptured in Florida in 1978, following the murder of 2 women at the Chi Omega sorority house and a 12-year-old girl, his prison life changed significantly. Bundy faced a much more secure prison environment as he awaited trial for his Florida crimes. He spent time in various Florida prisons, including Rayford and Stark, where he was eventually placed on death row. Even while incarcerated, Bundy worked on his own defense, using his legal knowledge to try to delay his execution. He frequently filed appeals, representing himself at times and using every available legal strategy to prolong his life. His arrogance and desire for control were evident in how he conducted his legal battles, often viewing himself as smarter than the system. Bundy's interactions with other inmates and staff varied over time. Initially, he was able to form relationships with some of his fellow prisoners and maintained a level of influence. Bundy was not particularly violent toward other inmates, and reports suggest he was able to manipulate or win over some of them, just as he did with people outside of prison. His intelligence and charm gave him a certain level of respect, or at least a buffer from harm in the prison environment. Bundy had a steady stream of visitors, including his longtime girlfriend, Elizabeth Klupfer, and later Carol Ann Boone, a woman who believed in his innocence and would eventually marry him while he was on death row. Carol Boone even gave birth to Bundy's child in 1982 after conceiving during one of her prison visits. This relationship allowed Bundy to maintain some semblance of normality during his incarceration. As Bundy's appeals began to fail and his execution date approached, he became more isolated and his psychological state began to deteriorate. On death row, Bundy was kept in near-total isolation. His manipulative charm faded as he faced the reality of his situation, and many prison staff reported that he grew increasingly despondent as his execution date drew closer. Despite this, Bundy continued to fight for his life through legal appeals, interviews, and confessions. Toward the end of his life, Bundy began confessing to more murders in a last-ditch effort to delay his execution. He provided details about crimes to investigators, though he was often evasive or gave incomplete information. These confessions were an attempt to buy more time, as he promised to reveal more details if his execution was delayed. Bundy was not known to have suffered serious physical harm while in prison, though he was a highly watched and isolated inmate due to the nature of his crimes. He was not attacked by other inmates, largely due to his separation from the general prison population and the notoriety of his case. However, Bundy did experience emotional and psychological strain, particularly as his execution date loomed. Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair on January 24, 1989, at Florida State Prison in Stark. His execution was a media spectacle, with crowds of people gathered outside the prison celebrating his death, some holding signs that read, "Burn Bundy, burn." He was reportedly calm in the hours leading up to his execution, though he spent his final moments trying to avoid death by offering more confessions. Ted Bundy's time in prison was a complex mix of manipulation, self-preservation, and isolation. While he initially tried to maintain control over his fate through charm and legal strategies, the reality of his crimes and impending execution eventually caught up with him. Though he was not physically harmed in prison, Bundy spent much of his final years in isolation, fighting to delay his death through legal appeals and confessions. His execution marked the end of a long and terrifying chapter in American criminal history. Even decades after his death, Bundy's life and crimes continue to be explored in books, documentaries, and films. This continued interest raises ethical questions about how society remembers and discusses serial killers, particularly in regard to the victims and their families. In the end, Bundy's legacy is one of tragedy and loss, but also of important changes in how law enforcement handles violent crime and the public's increased awareness of personal safety.